called Black Everything. Everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today via Skype by Liana Asim and Jabari Asim, who are coming to us from Boston, or outside of Boston, is it?
Just outside of Boston.
Liana is a playwright and librettist, most recently a stage reading of her play Bedfellows, which looks at the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Fry Speed and their intimate companionship, and I will ask you about that, Liana. We're also joined by Jabari Asim, noted editor, the author of several books, including most well-known, The N-Word, Who Can Say It, Who Shouldn't, and Why, What Obama Means for Our Culture, Our Politics, and Our Future. And he's also the editor of a book, Not Guilty, 12 Black Men Speak Out on Law, Justice, and Life, as well as the author of several children's books and the forthcoming novel, Only the Strong, an American Novel. Paula Penn Nabrit writes of Liana and Jasim, I love Liana Asim and Jabari Asim. I love the fierceness of who they are individually and the power of who they are together. And we are happy to have the both of you here together on Left to Black. How are you doing?
We're excellent. Happy to be here. Happy to be alive.
You two, and we've been doing these series the last couple of years where we really wanted to get people to sit down who are working partners, particularly creative types, to talk about the relationship as you work through the partnership, as you work through the relationship, and in your case, as you work through raising all of those children. So let me start in some ways by talking about everything that's going on in the world. You know, Eric Garner, obviously Mike Brown and Ferguson, you both have roots in St. Louis. Liana, you in particular have been one of those folks that have been digitally on the ground, you know, making sure that we get a feed of information about everything related to what's happening in Ferguson via Facebook. How have some of these issues affected you, knowing all these boys that you've raised, just about all of them, I believe, to adulthood at this point?
Yeah, well, our youngest is still at home. Our last two boys, 17 and 13. And I decided after the Eric Garner incident that I needed to check in and sort of make sure that I knew all the details so that it wouldn't happen again. And of course, since then, you know, it has, but it's my philosophy, my spiritual philosophy is that you do all that you can and stand on faith. Mm-hmm. So I needed a platform, some way to constantly check in with the details and learn from this situation, and also try to maybe force others to learn, because people on the page somehow would like to accept sort of ignorance and complacency instead of making a conscious effort to be informed and move forward.
Jabari?
Well, you know, there really is no disconnect or separation between what I do as a creative artist or as a scholar and what I do at home. I mean, all of my creative work, all of my intellectual work, I start first as a husband, then as a father, and finally as a creative artist and someone who observes and engages with the world. So there really is quite a bit of overlap between what I do in terms of my nonfiction writing, my fiction writing, and what I do as a husband and father. And part of it is, you know, Richard Wright talked about Black people finding a space in the world compatible with the dignity of their aspirations. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I always responded to that. And that's what I try to do in my work, to help us find, maybe identify, create, expand this space that is compatible with our aspirations and all of their wonderful abundance, difference, and complexity.
What's the conversations been like with your children around everything that's going on?
Painful. On my part, tearful. Sometimes you feel like, I feel like I haven't, you know, done enough. Even though our children are well-read, mm-hmm. you know, they have a balance between their intellectual life and their spiritual life. And we've encouraged them to go. I've taken them to marches. I've encouraged them to go on their own. They've decided to go on their own. We talk about it in a casual way, but also balance it with a lot of support, a lot of love. We've tried to raise the children as citizens of the world. So what's happening now, sort of makes them hesitant about going out into the world. And we just want to make sure I do want to make sure that I'm propping them up so that they can continue on the path that we set, that we started, that you can be anything and go anywhere despite, the odds or the efforts against you.
We're joined by Liana and Jabari Asim, who are talking about their work together, their work as creative artists, their works as parents, and as partners. How long have the two of you been married?
We've been married 28 years. We've been together 31 years.
Wow, where did you meet?
We met at Northwestern, and we met sort of as creative artists. We hung out in a place called the Black House, African American Student Affairs. And there was a bulletin board in the Black House, and in my youthful arrogance, I had declared myself the poet in residence. So I would type up my poems and tack them onto this bulletin board. And I sort of knew Liana casually, but she came to me and said, well, I'm a performer. And she had some of my poems in her hand, and she said, let's talk about these because I'd be interested in performing these. Now, I can't honestly remember if you ended up performing them or not, but a relationship grew out of that kind of connection.
Something productive happened. Jabari, it's interesting with everything going on now, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, and you go back 13 years to Not Guilty, and all the themes that were covered in that book, I was fortunate to be a contributor to it. It's a book that I still go back to very often in terms of reading some of the other contributions. Are you surprised that 13 years later, we're essentially in the same space, if not a worse space, and ironically, under the leadership of an African-American president?
Well, I think that's one of the great complications about this. When I was working on What Obama Means, I was really wrestling with this idea of radical optimism, which I was trying to prepare myself to embrace. And so I really wanted, for the first time in my life, to overcome my deeply indwelling skepticism about racial possibilities and embrace this radical optimism. And, in retrospect, it seems we're almost at a lower point now than we were before we began. So on one hand, I'm not surprised that we're revisiting the same themes that you and I visited in Not Guilty. But on the other hand, I'm surprised that we've almost, instead of standing still even, have gone backwards in some regards.
Liana, are you disappointed at all by any of the president's rhetoric in response to Black Lives Matter and these really tragic deaths that really almost, sanction state violence against Black people in general, but obviously, more specifically in this particular moment, Black men and boys?
I've been trying to put myself in his shoes, and not respond with pessimism. So what I've been thinking is that we know that his own family has been under attack. We know that people have made it all the way through the White House doors to try to kill them, or bullets through the doors. And so I think my feeling is that he's trying to ride it out, and that there are some hat tricks left, in these next 2 years. I mean, just like the immigration, the immigration thing, it's a surprise, that he did that. So I think there's some more surprises to come, and I think that he's just trying not to stir up too much ire, towards him. I had one of my playwright friends say her husband came home after an incident, and she said to him, well, why do you think this happened? Why do you think it went on? And her husband said, I think that the man was trying to shoot. He was in his head shooting at another Black man. He was shooting at Obama. I really think that that's what that in their head they can't take down the president, so they will take down whatever Black man that they can find. Now that psychologically, of course, you can't prove that, but it did stick with me, that idea, that notion that if you this is their way sort of to fight back a certain class, a certain section of our society. Um, so I think he's just playing itself for self-preservation. And to me, that's okay. Because before he was a president, he was a father and a husband. And so he's already done amazing things. So I'm going to cut him some slack.
Trust his judgment, yeah.
Yes.
You know, it's interesting the way that you just talked about how black men then become this stand-in for the anger that's directed at Obama, which is really a fascinating concept. And when you think about Darren Wilson's response in his testimony, and all the kind of adjectives that he's using, superhuman, extra human, subhuman, never human, you know, to describe Mike Brown. And you know, we get into these conversations about, you know, why would he think that? But clearly this man believed everything that he said. Yeah, he might have been coached, and it's probably a good bet that he was coached. But in some ways, you know, we keep hearing stories that these cops really believe. I mean, these cops who roll up on a 12-year-old and shoot him within 2 seconds, there's something already in their head about what they expect to see when they show up there in the park. You know, how do we get past that kind of moment and really do the work of continuing, and it seems ridiculous, continuing, you know, to humanize black people, continuing, you know, to humanize black men and black women?
Well, you know, I've actually thought about this in doing the page, you know, and people posting different things. And I thank you for your wonderful, insightful posts as well. But I realized that there is a difference between the people who protect us and the people who protect, let's say, the president. In Congress. They require them to be much more educated, to be better trained, and it's more of us. So why don't, you know, why are I think I read somewhere that there's a police test where the top score is 50, but most test below 22, so less than half. And it's okay. They prefer men who are below average. And so they have below average men hiring other below average bullies. They usually have some type, it's okay if they have a record. It's okay if they, you know, have a couple of criminal offenses, as long as they're not, you know, felonies. So it's, we've let that go on too long. We've ignored it. So why would we have the people who will protect America, the people who are responsible for serving and protecting, be ignorant and base because we haven't paid enough attention, or because our country hasn't paid enough attention to that. And so we have to take them to task. We have to correct that. We have to look at the laws. In Dallas, I was reading about the Dallas police force. One of the citizens groups are requiring that they amend the law from shoot to kill to shoot to obey. That means we haven't read those laws. Right. We don't know what the language says. And that's kind of our fault. And so we, as citizens, so as right now, the educating ourselves and the moving for change, past the marching, past the anger, it requires a certain level of hard work, of follow through, of not just being pissed off, but being deliberate in our efforts, being deliberate in our change, the things that we systematically can move and change.
I mean, you point to the fact that there are no quick fixes, you know, in this regard. I've always felt, you know, around the election of President Obama that, you know, we figured out how to elect a black president. You know, we haven't quite figured out how to help a black president govern. And you know, that demands very different kind of skill sets and tasks and commitments and what have you. But as you talk about what's going to be kind of a long game here, you know, in terms of trying to address issues of aggressive policing, we have young folks who are in the street now, and in some ways incredibly creative, the whole idea of a die-in. Have you been surprised at all, you know, at how these protests has cropped up all around, both in terms of the streets in major urban cities, but also in places on college campuses? You know, the two of you are a little older than I am, but I can't really remember.
Just a little.
But I can't really remember this level of organized protest since the anti-apartheid movement on college campuses in the mid-1980s. Have you been surprised at all about some of this outpouring of protests?
I am a little bit, particularly when you talk about college campuses and you're talking about African American middle class students who may perceive that they have something to lose
Yeah.
if they take these kind of risks. I remember I was at a conference at Georgetown University a few years ago, and I wrote about this. And Hakeem Adabudi was trying to get the students to see that the country was in bad condition and that we were in a precarious place. And I looked around, and these students were so privileged and so comfortable that they seemed visibly indifferent to the urgency of his message. So it made me a little cynical, but now I see kids who look just like those kids that I saw at Georgetown. They're out in the street and they're leading these protests. So there has been some kind of cultural shift for sure.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Liana Asim and Jabari Asim, working partners. Liana is a playwright and librettist. Most recently, her play Bedfellows, about Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Fry Speed. And Jabari Asim, a longtime author, editor. I could go on and on. I've often described him as the hardest working person in the industry. You both are creatives, and I've been struck by some of the criticism coming from young folks of their contemporary artists and the fact that they're waiting for them to kind of weigh in, musically and creatively. Is there a model for how creative artists can really react to things as they're emerging in the streets as they are? We get this kind of sense that, Curtis Mayfield was writing for the riot. But this is stuff that he spent some time with. And not all of this stuff was popular, when these artists released it. It's only in a kind of revisionist history that we think about this was a great song of the Civil Rights Movement. Well, during the Civil Rights Movement, folks weren't necessarily checking for this song.
Right.
But if you had any suggestions to young folks who are waiting for their creative artists to weigh in, what's that process like for creatives?
I think that other people should worry about themselves, actually, and always, nitpicking at what someone else is doing. I use Harry Belafonte as an example. We know what Harry Belafonte has done or did back in the 60s because we read about it now. Right. During that period, it was very much covert.
Right.
He was walking. He was driving down to the South with cash, getting people out of jail.
Right.
But
right.
he didn't. He didn't have a sign up. He
right.
didn't.
He didn't have a Facebook page. Right.
Right. Publish it in the newspaper. So I think we should be very careful about criticizing them to the point where we just assume that they're doing nothing.
Right.
Because I think that they are doing something, and as we are, they're doing what they can. Because we also have to remember there's a history of being sanctioned.
Persecuted.
Is it Dancing in the Street song? I can't remember what the woman's name is, or where some people, protested or made protest songs and their careers disappeared.
Right.
So that's
Free to Pain. Free to Pain.
Band of Gold.
Yeah. So some of them. So they're aware of that as well. This is their livelihood. So it's different. We want to say our celebrities, but that's their jobs. So again, I say focus on yourself. What are you doing? What is the individual doing? And leave the criticism. It's out of place, really.
Yeah, Lerone Bennett always says that it's not important that we all do the same thing. It's more important that we all do something. And so on a lot of levels, we need to pay attention to our particular struggles and where's the point of entry for us in this conversation, in this ongoing struggle. What can we do? I can't sing, for example. So I'm not going to do a song. What can I do? I can write a little bit, so I'm going to write about it. So I think it's more important that everybody try to do a little bit. And like Liana said, stop, swiveling our heads to see what everybody else is doing. Same time, you've got these long-term models like Ossie and Ruby and people like that who kind of exemplify for us how we should conduct ourselves in these times.
Liana, talk a little bit about this play, Bedfellows. What's going on there?
Well, I was doing some research on, I have this play called Slut Walk, or a play about Marilyn Monroe. Mm-hmm. And one of the things about Marilyn Monroe is that she kept a little picture of Abraham Lincoln on her nightstand as sort of her surrogate, father figure. And so I started thinking about Abraham Lincoln, and I, checked out a couple of books, and I came across this one line that said that Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Fry Speed were intimate companions, and that they slept in the same bed for 4 years. And when I started to do a little digging, I came across the idea that on January 1st, 1841, Abraham Lincoln possibly, tried to commit suicide after Joshua Fry Speed told him, "I'm selling the place where we live, and I'm moving back to Kentucky, and I'm getting married. And also, by the way, I want you to dump Mary Ann Todd." And so history suggests that Abraham Lincoln took a emotional dive and tried to commit suicide. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to put that day on the stage and have people learn something about one of our big icons, one of our the people that people from all walks of life identify and read about and know particulars about. And so I discovered a lot of interesting ideas about Abraham Lincoln, about his feelings about slavery, and they weren't all as happy, joy as I thought. His comments about Christianity. Some of it was just a little eye-opening, a little. In the play, I discuss him discussing possibly taking the slaves and sending them to an island, and like that was a serious consideration.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that some of the discoveries will be just as revelatory and start a new conversation about fluid sexuality, and also about love, because Joshua Fry Speed obviously, forget about physical love, but he loved him enough to let him go, loved him enough to realize that he was going to be something more, and I hope that the audience will leave with the idea that when you run across an Abraham Lincoln, you will love them enough to nurture them or let them go or push them forward to a great and glorious future.
You mentioned that the two of you met, Liana, in response to Jabari's work 31 years ago. How has that working relationship changed over the last 30-something years?
I don't know if it has very much. Jabari is my soulmate, and I was certain of that early on. He echoed some of the language that my father used. He always talked about legacy and kingdom building, and he wanted a lot of children. He wanted 7 children, and my compromise was 5. So the language was familiar, to me, and it was, so I connected intellectually, and we connected spiritually in a way, because when God told me that he was going to be my husband, and that's the way it came to me, it was easy to believe. So my belief in him has been consistent, and likewise, I can do this playwriting because when it's time for me to write, he says, kids, leave your mom alone. She needs some space. She needs some time. When I whined about how hard the writing was, because writing actually is kind of new for me, to take it this seriously. I wrote a little bit of stuff, when I used to run a theater company 20 years ago, but on this level required some new energy. And so Jabari has been, giving me those gentle nudges and also allowing me to find the space and encouraging me to find the space.
Talk a little bit about that, both of you, because, the kids part is real, right? The demands that kids have, trying to find quiet spaces in your own lives to be able to do your own creative work, needing to get out the house every once in a while to do that creative work, sometimes having to bring the kids with you to do that work. I know it's not all rosy, because I know what my life is, right? Sure. But how do you work? How has it been really working through those challenges so that, you never feel envious, of your partner for being able to get work done when you can't?
Yeah, well, a couple of ways to address it. But first, I wanted to add that in terms of the working relationship, we are each other's first reader, and always have.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And a couple of my books, Not Guilty and The N-Word, were both Liana's ideas, not mine. She came to me and said, you know, you should do a book on this. And I said, why? And then in each instance, once she explained, I said, you know what, that's a really good idea. I'm going to do that. But both of those sprung from her mind first. But also in terms of the quiet space thing, I'm really sympathetic to that. Yeah. But I sort of respond to it the way Gandhi responded to the idea of Western civilization. He said it would be a good idea, right? So I think a quiet space would be a good idea. But I can't say that either of us have ever experienced that. I've written all my books with my children hanging off of me, and quite a bit of noise, but you know, absolutely no complaints there, because that's what I wanted. You know, I have 4 sons, 1 daughter, and I'm grateful for all of them. And they, you know, they behave in a way that's conducive for us to produce, but they're almost always in the room. I've seldom written in isolation, if ever.
Yeah, and they're very encouraging. Like, you know, the pinnacle of my profession is winning a Tony Award. So once I said that to the kids, and my daughter said to me, "Mom, why just stop at a Tony? EGOT." I didn't even know if she knew what an EGOT was. And then the other one chimed in, "Yeah, you need an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar," and I tell her,
get to work.
Right? So I thought, you know, I love that. And we don't, you know, our parents were a little bit more conservative. They wanted us to be something they could put their finger on.
Right.
So, and so we chose a slightly different path. But so we're conscious of that with them. We tell them that they can choose anything, and it doesn't surprise Jabari, but it surprises me that they're all creative. You know, that they haven't chosen anything conventional. It seems.
Although we would kind of like to get an accountant out of the bunch. Not so far, but you know, we got our fingers crossed.
Liana and Jabari, thank you for joining us today. It's been wonderful talking to you. We see your Kwanzaa candles in the back. So enjoy your holiday season.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for having us.
I'm grateful.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.